On this edition of the News Review, the Iranian president blasts the U.S. for refusing to lift sanctions against his country amid the coronavirus pandemic. Hassan Rouhani says Washington's defiance of calls to remove the sanctions will go down in history as a stigma for U.S. rulers. He said the U.S. refusal indicates that it's pursuing both economic and medical terrorism against Iran. Rouhani was speaking at a cabinet meeting in Tehran. Elsewhere, he urged international organizations, including the International Monetary Fund, to help fight the coronavirus pandemic.
I urge all international organizations to fulfill their duties in these circumstances. We are a member of the IMF. We are paying our quota. We have allocated them some of our resources. We will not tolerate any discrimination on their part regarding our loan request.
Well, last month, the Central Bank of Iran made a request to the IMF for a $5 billion emergency loan. Tehran stressed that it was entitled to benefit from the fund's rapid financing instrument. On Tuesday, reports suggested that U.S. officials were planning to block Iran's request. Joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have international lawyer Barry Grossman joining us from Bali, also publisher and editor of Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos joining us from the British capital, London. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Grossman. Sir, walk us through the recent comments made by the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. He did highlight that the U.S.'s refusal indicates that Washington is pursuing both economic and medical terrorism against Iran. Do you see it in that light as well?
Well, call it what you will, but the president is clearly very correct, and not a great deal needs to be said by him to illuminate not only the crimes of the United States, but the hypocrisy of the IMF itself, which nominally is an organization run by European nations, but which works very closely with the World Bank, and moreover is typically dominated by individuals with very clear loyalties to the United States. There's really no way to dress this up. Of course, perhaps people at the IMF would point out that Iran's membership is conditional in the sense that there are several provisions or obligations in Article 8 of the relevant agreement, which Iran quite understandably does not submit to, and made that very clear from the start. But there's no excuse for it taking this long, and for the IMF in any event to refuse to provide the loan in question. Remember, Iran, like other nations in the world right now, is facing a critical situation in this crisis. The management of this crisis in Iran is as important to the rest of the world as it is to Iranians. And what we're seeing time and time again as this crisis unfolds is the United States executive taking unilateral action on many fronts, which are clear violations of the international order, which it typically seeks to impose on other countries, whether we're talking about pirating urgently needed medical aid destined for other countries, or continuing with its own unilateral sanctions against Iran and back-channel threats against any nation which doesn't submit to the United States demand that they continue to give effect to those sanctions in dealing with Iran.
Marcus Papadopoulos, Tehran last month asked the Central Bank of Iran, made a request to the IMF asking for a $5 billion emergency loan. Reports are suggesting that the United States is planning to block Iran's request. Is it legal? I mean, on legal grounds, is the United States even allowed to intervene in that regard?
Well, I'm always concerned when a country of geostrategic importance, which pursues an independent foreign policy, is fervently patriotic and is targeted by America, is a recipient of loans from the International Monetary Fund. Because the IMF is not an independent or humanitarian organization. The IMF is an arm of the American government. Indeed, the IMF is a formidably potent weapon of America, which it has employed for many decades now in all four corners of the world. In short, if a country is a member of the IMF and receives loans from the IMF, then this enables the American government to have a say in the internal affairs of that country, presents the Americans with leverage which they relish the opportunity to use over a country which pursues an independent foreign policy and which Washington is very much eager to see overturned, so that the foreign policy of this country, the independent foreign policy of this country, is replaced by a foreign policy which is pro-Western. So whilst on the one hand, I understand the reasons for why Iran and other countries as well are recipients of IMF loans, on the other hand, I would urge great caution to Iran for receiving loans from the IMF. But as I said, Iran is not alone in receiving loans from the IMF. Indeed, following the split between Tito and Stalin in 1948, Yugoslavia reluctantly received IMF loans. So much so was it reluctant that Tito lamented that there can be no true independence without a truly independent foreign policy. That was very, very accurately and well said by Tito, and I think it can be applied exactly the same as he said it then to the world today.
All right, Mr. Grossman, one last question. Do you think at times like this, not just legally but morally, countries that invoke sanctions on other countries should be bound to remove them, at least if they're talking of a global approach in fighting this pandemic? A global approach means helping all countries fight it.
Well, look, I mean, the United States has already been instructed in very clear terms by the International Court to, at the very least, make exceptions in terms of its unilateral sanctions, the legality of which remains an open question, but to make exceptions when it comes to humanitarian aid, foodstuffs, medical equipment, and the like. And of course, the United States is ignoring that. And let's not also lose sight of the fact that I doubt very much that Iran would feel it necessary to request this loan if it wasn't for the continuing economic terrorism being directed at it by the United States establishment. To be sure, I agree wholeheartedly with what our colleague is saying about the IMF. This is not a crew that you, as the leader of a nation, want to get in bed with. But I'm also not going to second guess the government and the president of Iran. They're dealing with a crisis, no doubt that requires a lot of cash, especially when it comes to paying for any such international medicine and the like that they are able somehow to purchase. And it's really quite absurd for the IMF not to, as a matter of high priority, process that request as expeditiously as possible. And there's no room in any of this for the United States to be lording it over anyone at the IMF, albeit that we all know very well that that's exactly what happens day in and day out. And as our colleague said, we all know that the IMF itself is a sort of a mechanism, if you like, for infiltrating and taking over the economies and foreign policy of sovereign nations. But be that as it may, this is an urgent situation, a crisis. Iran needs to have the funds which have been denied to it as a result of U.S. sanctions. And it seems highly appropriate that the IMF should grant this loan as expeditiously as possible.
Thanks a lot, gentlemen. International lawyer Barry Grossman joining us from Bali. Also thanks to Marcus Papadopoulos speaking to us from the British capital, London. With that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review, but there's plenty more to come here on Press TV.